In this last video, we will be looking at the other 7 Emily Dickinson poems in our book. The 3 that I have already mentioned are about day-to-day life and observations of the world around her. And the other 4, I will make the 3 poems on page 312, plus We Never Know How High We Are, somewhat tangentially connected to them, and not a very well-known poem of hers, on page 313. I'll ask at that time whether you can see what those poems have in common. It's a little more difficult to work out than with the others, but I do see a link between them. As I said, the 3 poems that show observation are A Bird Came Down the Walk, and 2 on page 315, The Day Came Slow Till 5 o'clock, and Apparently With No Surprise. We'll start with the best known poem and the one that is the longest and has the most in it, A Bird Came Down the Walk. I always imagine this as a robin, although I have no way of knowing. But it's a very interesting poem because poets write about nature all the time. Of course, there are innumerable poems about birds and flowers, and we have looked at some of them this school year. But Emily Dickinson always has an unusual way of looking at things, sometimes a harsh way, sometimes a way that is focused on God and the promise of the afterlife. But in 2 of these poems, it is certainly more on the harsh side. In Apparently With No Surprise, she writes simply about the frost coming along and makes it like a guillotine. She has, if you look at page 315, she has the frost beheading the flower in a wonderful phrase, a blonde assassin. Sounds like some terrible Nazi-ish assassin figure from a movie. But what she means is that the frost is of a light color and yet is something actually deadly and murderous to the flower. The approving God at the end of that poem could possibly be seen positively, although to me it seems a little sinister. God is watching with pleasure that the frost comes along in the winter and destroys things. However, we don't have to look at it that way. We can look at it simply that there are cycles of nature. There is winter, but then there is spring. As in the 6th and 7th lines of the poem, the day and the night pass, and God watches the creation he made, pleased with it, as in the Bible, and God saw that it was good. So you can see it in either way in this poem. Getting back to A Bird Came Down the Walk, I would say the same thing in this one. We tend to think of songbirds and the kind of birds that hop around gardens as cute, as pretty, and certainly she has some of that. He drank dew out of I would imagine, a sort of curved side of a blade of grass. He hopped past a beetle. Emily Dickinson, as the poet characters, enjoys seeing him, so she bends down and offers him a crumb, and he softly and gently, with lovely comparisons to oars and to butterflies, flies away, perhaps after eating it, or perhaps nervous of her without eating it. On line 15 and 16, she has a very interesting metaphor. He unrolled his feathers and rode him softer home. What is the bird doing exactly here? There's actually a little story in A Bird Came Down the Walk. The bird eats and drinks. The poet comes out, offers him a crumb, and seemingly frightened, he flies away. But as I said, the cuteness of the bird, just as in the frost, the blonde assassin, is somewhat belied by Dickinson being honest about what nature is really like. The opening stanza of this poem, a real classic, I will just read it through, and you can look at page 313. A bird came down the walk. He did not know I saw. He bit an angleworm in halves and ate the fellow raw. Birds eat worms, but in the poetry of Keats, Shelley, Whitman, Hardy, great writers about birds as sort of a poetic inspiration, they don't violently bite worms in half. In Emily Dickinson's world, they do. A couple of other points about it. The looked like frightened beads, I think, is a wonderful simile for the bird's eyes. Obviously, beady eyes for small black eyes is nothing unusual, but the idea of frightened beads certainly gives an image of this particular bird as she approaches it. Lovely last image, even though it is completely unrealistic, on lines 19 and 20. Butterflies leaping off the banks and swimming. Of course, butterflies don't. Once again, Dickinson choosing an unusual image to make a point different from what a poet normally would. Finally, if you turn 2 pages, the day came slow till 5 o'clock. Not that the day passed slowly until the sun set, but the day rose slowly, and then at 5 o'clock in the morning, with the poet perhaps looking out her window, having the time in that pre-technology world to watch the sunrise grow, she does a wonderful description of it. Again, you can see the similes and metaphors. In the first stanza, perhaps a not unusual one, the colors being like jewels, rubies, topaz, which I believe is a blue jewel in the second stanza, but the light a musket spills, again an almost violent image. And in stanza 3, she has this interesting image of almost a mythological image of the wind is the prince of the birds. Well, you could say that. The wind is sort of like their monarch. They depend on him, or it. The wind could blow them around dangerously or help them fly, and so they're sort of arranged watching it as if in some king's court, some procession. So kind of an entire analogy there, almost an extended metaphor. For the final category, we leave the world of birds eating worms and of natural things that Emily Dickinson saw, and get a little more abstract outside of some of the illustrations that she comes up with and some of the metaphors. Success is counted sweetest, and the other 2 poems on page 312, I would say, have some relationship to We Never Know How High We Are. What is the connection? One critic said that Emily Dickinson wrote about fame as one of her themes. Certainly as an unknown poet, and one who perhaps thought no one would ever read her poetry, she was interested in the idea of being famous, of literature as one way to achieve that, and I'll talk later about the 2 poems that are about that. But how does one succeed? Well, in We Never Know How High We Are, what she is saying is we never know how much we will succeed until actual challenges come along. Heroism that I think in the 5th line we recite is almost like the heroism in epics, like telling it in epic poetry, but we are warping our cubits, a biblical word there, Goliath being 6 cubits and a span tall. We bend down ourselves almost out of fear for not being the heroes that we could be. But if it comes up, we will find that we can do it. Success is counted sweetest, a similar idea, but a much better known poem of hers, and much more of a bittersweet one with that kind of harsh tang that so many of Dickinson's poems have. Success is counted sweetest by those who ne'er succeed. Success is the most meaningful if you fail. One athlete I remember was quoted as saying, "It hurts more to lose a game than it feels good to win it." And I think a lot of people could say that's true from experience. Emily Dickinson illustrates this very strongly in the second and third stanzas of Success is Counted Sweetest by imagining a dying soldier, a wonderfully strong, painful image. As he's lying there dying, he can hear the people, perhaps the trumpets, the drums, the sounds of triumph, those who won, cheering and celebrating their victory. He, she is saying, is the one who could really tell what success is. He who will never experience it. A simple metaphor, her writing as a letter, but notice the sort of loneliness, the awareness of her isolation in those first two lines. This is my letter to the world that never wrote to me. Just like Anne Bradstreet, she has this idea of sending her poems out to the audience, perhaps being nervous, as Bradstreet was, of the alleged dirty, ragged child that her poems were. She's saying that this is going to hands I cannot see in line 6, and so she's actually picturing her poems being in someone's hands. They are reading them as we are today, and she gives a touching little conclusion saying, "Judge tenderly of me. Whoever you are who read my poems, please judge me gently." There is no frigate like a book connects to this because it is about literature again. But now she's talking about a book or writing about a book. A frigate, kind of an old-fashioned word. You probably don't know it, but as you can see from the picture, it's a boat. It's a big boat, bigger than a bark. And coursers, you can see that also from the fourth line, prancing. Those are horses. So she uses two metaphors to describe literature, that books are like big ships or they are like horses, horses that are pulling a chariot in line 7. Well, what do ships and horses pulling a carriage or chariot do? Of course, they move you somewhere else. They take you on a trip, and that's what a book does. It takes you on a trip to a new and interesting place, no matter how poor you are. As she points out in the poem, you can read a book and even today be transported to exciting and different new places.